meaning that you're able to then predict as well as you can. We're talking about the review and the preparation for the examination. Let me give you a little bit of a preview, and then we can even spend time in class today focusing more on the preparation for the examination. I think that that's a reasonable dialogue to have on the DVDs as well. The exam is a week from today, is that right? And so you need to come in well prepared to write, bringing a blue book with you, or a dozen blue books, whatever you would like, bringing pens, pencils, whichever you prefer. If you scratch out and have to rewrite something, it doesn't bother me. I know that some of you are whiteout compulsive. You bring your own little bottles of whiteout and you white out stuff and you write over it and you blow on it to get it dry and all of that. That's fine. If you want to do it in pencil, that's all right. I would recommend a number 3 lead pencil, number 2 lead pencil. Don't bring in those number 11 lead pencils that where they sell them, I don't know, that you can't read. Keep in mind that we try to read as quickly as we possibly can, and the more difficult it is to read, probably there's a subjective dimension, and that is the harder it is to read, you have sort of negative evaluation of the numbers rather than positive. You know what I'm saying? There was a study done years ago at Harvard University. This is back when people typed. You've never heard of typing. But they compared type papers and handwritten papers, and the type papers got a full letter grade above their handwritten version, blindly graded. So the notion is that presentation counts. So feel comfortable. As I've said before, I would recommend doing the IDs first. A very short answer, crisp and to the point. Spend the rest of the time lingering on the essay questions. There is no premium. I don't look at the first 3 people out and immediately assume that they've done very well and give them an A. There is no reason to rush out. Take your time. Take a nap if you want. I don't care. But I'm just saying there's no reason to hurry through this and to get out. Some of you say, I just wanted to get this over. No, I don't know. I would say write it, rewrite, a little bit here and there. If you see something, maybe you even double space if you want to, and you can go back and add if you decide to. You know, all of these kinds of things I'm very, very forgiving, because what I'm really wanting an exam to do is to give you an opportunity to show what you have learned. I'm not interested in finding out what you haven't, but obviously an examination can do that. The exam is a week from today, and then we will finish our lectures on Thursday of this week and spend some time in formal review if you would like. And typically in formal review it is much more meaningful if you say, well, this is what I would write for this. Am I on the right track, or something along that line. Don't expect me to just lecture. For instance, if you were to say, well, how would you answer question number 1? You're going to find me being smarty. Remember, I had an older sister. I learned how to be smart alecky. I've got about 30 answers to that. I say, for instance, very well, clearly, completely accurately. See what I'm saying is that I won't fall for that. For those people who say, well, if I just show up for the review and I can get him to tell me 16 lines that I can quickly write down or get on tape or maybe on the DVD or the video over in the library, then I don't have to do the rest of this work. So it's much better if you come in and say, this is what I'm thinking about, or I'm confused here, and heavens only knows some of you will be confused more than others perhaps, etc., etc. So helping you to work through that confusion is fine. Does that give you an idea where we're going, all of that? It's okay, 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 okay. All of you are happy campers. I love happy campers. Yes?
The review is on Thursday?
The review is going to be on this coming Thursday, and the exam is on Tuesday following, a week from today, right? All right. Any other questions? Yeah. It will be at exactly the same time and in this room. It'll be on the class day, in this room, all right? That's what I'm assuming. I've checked with people who were checking with people who were checking with people, but this is where I plan to be, in this room, nowhere else. It is our room. The problem of trying to move somewhere else is difficult. not only is there no other room on campus at a particular time, they'd have to come over here, can't do that, but then that causes problems because you might imagine that there are some people that don't attend regularly, and then they show up and say, where did the class go? Oh my God, I've lost it. You know? And so, well, some of you would say that's their problem, not my problem, but I think these tables are quite comfortable. There's plenty of room in here, so we can do it in this room. That's one reason why I wanted to maintain the head count going in, so that we would have ample room within this room to do our exam. Any questions, comments, additional ones? Okay, let's kind of flip the calendar back. Recall Thursday of last week. I know typically you walk out, you forget everything, but then I try to go back and sort of reconnect us to where we were. We were talking about two sort of competing versions of information, and information relevant to decision making, and that's where all of this discussion of information theory comes in. How do we make decisions? Because it isn't just some kind of idle theoretical Zen discussion. It is helping us to understand how all of this works in the human mind, so that we then can, as communicators, better understand it and tailor communication activities to maximize the people that we are serving with communication, and those people may be ourselves, to be more successful. We talked about two very large theories, or maybe they're just models. I'm not going to worry about that. One is what we call the fixed decision model. We played a game of cards where we found a person that would pick a card, and then we went through a series of bits of information, reducing the uncertainty by half by each of the bit, and I recall that within 6 guesses we've figured out what was the card that had been drawn out of the deck of cards. We can do that because that is a fixed decision. There is a finite number of bits, and each of those bits, regardless, is going to reduce uncertainty. The other theory of information that we talked about has much more to do with the impact of information on the receiver, on you, the communicator, than it does in any fixed decision matrix. Now, there are decision matrix experts that try to turn everything into a fixed decision model, but most of us don't do that. We go through life getting information and making judgments of one kind or another. Returning to our old friend Cupid, those of you that will eventually get to see it, and I don't know whether that will happen, but I'm also saying to the people that will eventually get it on WebCT somewhere down the line in other classes, they began by having 3 people, one of them could be eliminated from that week's show. That's so typical of reality television. And so the uncertainty is, who is it that is out of the tribe, or who is it that is no longer Cupid and gets his arrow broken ceremoniously in front of the American public and is out of Lisa's life forever? So one person, and again that's kind of binary, isn't it? It's kind of a fixed decision model because not everybody is in that group, only one of them is in the group, and even when the announcer plays it up and kind of does it dramatically and then cuts to a station break, as a decision model, it remains the same. They're just simply playing with that kind of decision model to increase the dramatic value of the program to keep people watching. The other model, which we used the story about the burglary to deal with, was that as we get information, what we consider to be information, and we're in charge of that which we consider to be informative, we can sense the presence of information in a message by whether that information increases or decreases the uncertainty that we feel, experience. Sometimes it's intellectual, and sometimes it's not just intellectual. That results by that particular, whatever it is that is informative to us. We're going to talk more about this in interpersonal communication. We talk about uncertainty reduction theory later on. We talk about social cognition theory, because some of the things that are relevant to interpersonal communication is you trying to figure out what other people are like. Are they your friends? Are they your enemies? And again, it is exactly that same kind of model that is operating in the movie Cupid, where she goes on dates and her friends see what's going on. They sometimes experience these events, and from that they gather information that either increases or decreases their certainty about the availability, desirability of the various contestants competing to be her husband. Now you know that if you watch the entire Cupid series, and I suspect that I'm the only one that did, you note that some of these people kind of come and go. One week they're on the downhill side toward undesirable, and the next week they do something that moves them up a little bit. And Robert got a little bit redeemed as time goes on, and probably most of the people watching the show in a more objective way never understood why Robert was there at the end, because it was pretty obvious that at least the companions didn't like Robert. What's also important is that sometimes Lisa liked people more than her companions did, meaning that what was the effect of what they did affected the uncertainty and the directionality of the opinion on the part of her friends more than it did, or differently than it did for Lisa, which to me is a very, very important point to make, emphasizing that we are always interested in how receivers make sense of the world, if we like that word receiver, and it's functional to talk about it in this case, as opposed to thinking that there is something called an inherent amount of information in a news story. The informativeness of a news story is interpreted idiosyncratically by each of the readers, each of the viewers, each of the listeners. Well, having worked our way through that, hoping to be very clear as we have moved along, now what I would like to do is to begin to explore some of this in context. I thought I had a screen that focused on interpersonal. Anyway, let's assume that I have a screen that focuses on interpersonal communication. This is the first time that we've set out within a chapter to begin to apply the theory in contexts. And for instance, on page 153, you will see us beginning to discuss information in interpersonal contexts. We're going to discuss information and its role in three contexts: interpersonal communication, organizational communication, and mass-mediated communication. And that helps us to see how the basic theory within one of these areas of discussion then rolls into an understanding of communication phenomena in context. And remember, we set that model up early on in the semester, suggesting, for instance, that we're interested in theory in general, but then how that theory translates into what goes on in various kinds of contexts. And so now we can turn our attention to do that in the interpersonal context. There's some rather interesting conclusions that are drawn. One of those is that a fair amount of our interpersonal communication is oriented to information acquisition and uncertainty reduction. If you meet somebody for the first time, to what extent are you then trying to find out information about the individual? And some of that information is going to be influenced by any set of prejudgments that you may have, any kind of stereotypes that you may have, any kind of interest in the nature of the context that you may have. And obviously, if you know the person over a series of days, weeks, and months, your opinion of the individual may change over time as you get more information that either reshapes your hypotheses or conflicts with your hypotheses or does not support your hypotheses or does support your hypotheses, meaning, and we're going to get into a theory of interpersonal communication that argues that we're all naive scientists, that we go through the world getting information, trying to solve problems, and part of those problems have to do with interpersonal communication. A part of our interaction with other individuals can be motivated by our desire to reduce uncertainty on the assumption that uncertainty is uncomfortable. We'll explore that over and over and over again. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. The more important the information is to us may be a function of the way in which we're trying to manage uncertainty. I've got to believe that the three women involved in Cupid spent a lot of time talking about the various standing contestants because the consequence of making the right choice was pretty substantial. Part of it was Lisa wanted a husband. Secondly, if Lisa got a husband, got married on television, which she didn't eventually, and stayed married for a year, she got $1 million. She eventually, as I guess, gave up. I've not seen any of the trades, whether she got her $1 million after the fact or not. But she and Hank didn't get married. But I think that that puts a lot of consequences out there. But in our own way, in our own relationships, aren't we equally interested in who is this person? Do I really like this person? Does this person really like me? Et cetera, et cetera. Some amount of uncertainty there. Information is acquired to navigate relationship formation, and navigating that means that we begin relationships, we develop relationships, and then we may terminate relationships. Some of you come to the university and you get stuck in a suite with other people. My guess is that when you find that, or you're in an apartment and you've never spent time with your new apartment mate, to what extent do you try to figure out who this person is? And various events will change that will influence your understanding. And then sometimes you say we became very, very good friends, or we shortly got to the point where we hated each other and I never wanted to see this person again. We know that one of the consequences of the creation of a relationship is the termination of a relationship. And the question is whether a relationship is cost effective. A relationship is cost effective. Now, without information, we can't predict what other people are going to do. And we like to be able to predict what other people are going to do. Now, we may say of a relational partner, you became too predictable. But by the same token, we don't like people that are totally unpredictable. That we think that we're in love with a person and we want to see them again, and then all of a sudden they drift away for 3 weeks. Are we not interested in where they've been when they come back? And they say, nowhere. No, not really. No, just out. Shopping. Around. Are we satisfied with that information? Does that reduce our uncertainty, or do we call the FBI, the CIA, and somebody else to go and find out what's going on? We also know that interaction predicates on a variety of cybernetic principles. We've talked about that before. We do something, and we look to see whether the strategy of doing that something in one way or another brings about the success that we thought it might. If I, for instance, bring you flowers, or if I say, good morning, how are you, or whatever it might be, if it's an interview, and an interview is interpersonal communication, and I tell you a lot about myself, does that information lead to me getting a job or lead to me not getting a job? So you see, in some sense, we're interested in the strategic use of information, and one of the places in which that works is in negotiation. Now, let's take a little quick sidestep here and ask ourselves, to what extent is information power? Is information power? If you're negotiating the sale of a house or the buying of a house, wouldn't you like to know what's really on the other person's mind? What are they really willing to settle for? What are they really wanting as an asking price? One of the reasons that we often don't like to go out and buy a car from a car dealership is we figure that we're playing at their poker table with their cards, with their chips, and there are 7 people that are on their side of, or our side of the table, telling them what our cards are. There are dealerships that have even been found to bug this waiting room where the couple is left alone to talk while the salesperson is away, so that they can get information that might help them to come back and negotiate a more favorable arrangement, right? So information can be power. Information can be power. In that regard, is it likely then that we can think of 2 kinds of negotiation? One of those kinds of negotiation, we might say, is combative or competitive, where we think one side is going to win and the other side is going to lose. Are we likely to use and seek information differently if we feel a combative situation than if we see a cooperative situation? where we're trying to work together to pool our information so that together we can come up with a better decision. We call that integrative negotiation or collaborative decision making, where we're trying to collaborate, to work together to come up with a good solution. What's interesting is that over the last number of years, the medical profession has even moved over to collaborative efforts where doctors now are perhaps less likely to simply prescribe and more likely to discuss so that the patients can make an informed decision depending upon the nature of that decision. I had a very serious medical problem summer before last, and I was given a variety of options on what would be the possibility. I could have a procedure where they ended up cutting open my chest. Sounded rather dire, and they said you wouldn't be able to do a lot of things that you would normally do for 6 weeks. Okay, doesn't sound very good. We can go in and we can make a little mend by going in through your leg up, and it's a very simple thing, etc., etc. Oh, that sounded pretty good. Or we do nothing and you could end up with the same problem that you've got, and the next time it could be fatal. Well, now I've got a choice, don't I? I talked it over, and I think I felt empowered that I was moving toward comfortable amount of uncertainty. I mean, can you imagine that there was not some uncertainty involved in this, but a comfortable amount of uncertainty, because I felt that I was a part of a collaborative effort rather than somebody simply telling me what my options were. Well, real life stories as we deal with these sorts of things and try to understand then how this information that we're talking about, how the course content applies to our everyday circumstances. In interpersonal communication, we have something that's called co-orientation. We'll talk about this more as we go along. Co-orientation has three major variables associated with it, and if you are in a relationship of a romantic type with somebody or just a friendship, see how well your friendship or your romantic relationship stacks up on these dimensions. Accuracy. Accuracy. To what extent do you know what your partner knows, why your partner does what she or he does, all of that kind of stuff? If, for instance, I were to write down a statement about you, if you were my friend, and you were to read it, accuracy would be the extent to which I knew you as you think you are. Does that make sense? Accuracy. That I know you as you think you are. For instance, if we were to go to Wendy's, and you could certainly check this out with my wife and daughter, I'll sometimes get something different, but if I were to say to my wife and daughter, just the usual is number one with pickles, mustard, and onions, and a Coke. Predictable? Yes. Accurate? Yes. You see what I'm getting at? We would know one another. And accuracy is a benefit within a relationship, isn't it? It is a benefit within a relationship. Understanding means that if we're talking about something, we're talking about it in ways that we're talking about it in a similar way. One of the gender issues is that men talk about things like commitment in quite a different way than women do. Does commitment mean the same thing to a man that it means to a woman? And if not, you see there is then lower understanding than there is increased understanding. My wife and I have been married for 38 years. There is a lot of understanding because we've been around a long time. We've shared a lot of things. We know each other in that particular regard. And you get to the point where you can talk with a good friend in code terms. You can talk with a good friend in abbreviated terms because you really understand, having shared so much of what's going on. And finally, satisfaction. Satisfaction is mutual liking. Mutual liking. Mutual disliking, I guess. At least we're satisfied that there's a mutuality here. Now, how does information inform that? Well, accuracy is information-based. I can tell you stuff that can increase accuracy, understanding, and we can even talk through whether we are equally or appropriately satisfied by what's going on. Well, in that regard, then, there get to be some rather interesting matters. For instance, if you like somebody, are you likely to believe that they are more similar to you in attitude and opinion and knowledge than if you dislike someone. What do you think? I see a head nodding back there. You haven't spoken the whole semester. Here's your big chance. You're on television.
Yes, I think so, because you always feel attracted to people who have the same opinion or a similar opinion as you do.
And the more you like them, the more you think that it's similar.
There's a saying, tell me who you are, and or tell me the people with who you hang out, and I tell you who you are, you know.
Okay.
So I think this makes sense.
Okay, and the young woman behind you back there, what do you think? Push the button. This is your big moment.
Well, usually the people you hang out with are the people that are around you, the people that are closer to you and have the similar attitudes and think more the way that you do.
Are you sometimes then sort of shocked when somebody says something and you say, I didn't know that you believed that?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we found out something and we assumed that they didn't because they were our friend. And we thought that there would be more of what we call convergence rather than divergence. And those two terms become more important to us over time. One of the assumptions is that the more that a relationship becomes positive, the more we have divergence. I'm sorry. It should have been convergence, shouldn't it? See if you're listening there. Convergence coming together. Divergence coming apart, differing, disagreeing, and so forth. If we want to make ourselves unattractive, we become disagreeable, don't we? That's part of the film that I'm eventually going to get on WebCT, How to Dump a Guy in 10 Days or whatever it is. She became increasingly disagreeable, but he had a bet that he would win her over. That kept him there longer than maybe good sense would have dictated, particularly when she showed up with that really ugly dog. I can't imagine. I've never in my life. You know what I'm talking about? You haven't seen the movie, go out and rent it. It's part of your homework. Write it off as a tax write-off. It's part of your education. Disliking can distort the accuracy of our relational knowledge as well. The more we dislike somebody, does it ever really bother you when you find out somebody you really dislike holds an opinion similar to yours? And you say, well, that shouldn't be because that's not the way life is supposed to be. I really want to dislike this person, and if they're going to say that, then we even go so far as to say, well, you're only saying that because you want me to like you. Means that we're using it as a ploy to increase liking. So, in our discussion, and we're just kind of opening the door here in this chapter to a lot of what we will talk about later on under uncertainty reduction and relational development and so forth, but what we've suggested is that we are biased in our interpretation of relational information and the information relevant to relationships. We like to reduce uncertainty at least up to a point. I will say up to a point. When you get to be a parent of adolescence, I think there really is a point beyond which you don't want to know what's going on. You want to have this sort of distant hope because the reality may be greater than what you would really like. Our daughter came home one night at 3 o'clock in the morning. She said, why do you treat me like a goody-goody? Well, because we hate you. We think you're so disgusting that we even are offended by the fact that you show up. Why don't you just move out? Because we love you and we care about you. That's the scripted line, right? Then she looked at us and she said, well, don't you know that I know people that do, and she listed all of these things. Now that's the sort of reassuring information that makes parents then go to bed very comfortably saying, oh good, we are so happy that you in Houston are exposed to this seedy side of life. That really is reassuring because we, oh heaven forbid that we thought you really were a goody-goody, et cetera, et cetera. See, so sometimes it would be better. Well, that was one of those nights where we probably ended up cooking eggs before we ever before we ever went to bed. And those nights might have transpired in your family as well, where you kind of have to talk through things where you're dealing with angry, sullen, mean parents when you're an otherwise idyllic, wonderful teenager just trying to get them to go along with your plans of life, right? I mean, that's the tough part of negotiating teenagerhood, is having to deal with parents that just don't get it. Well, anyway, information becomes a part of that. It becomes a part of negotiation. It becomes a part of the context of interviewing. What information do I give out? One of the things that's rather interesting is a number of years ago, there was a study reported in the Wall Street Journal that suggested that 35% of all job applications have at least one statement on them that would warrant termination. Meaning, False information, inaccurate information becomes a part of this. I'm telling you something that may actually be untrue. Well, we talk about deception. Deception is an important part of our interpersonal efforts, isn't it? To what extent can I spot you deceiving me? We also know that relevant to that is our risk perception. How good are we at spotting risks? Risk meaning if I do certain sorts of things, I have either predictably positive or negative outcomes. Most of us are pretty bad at risk perception. Those of us that are really bad are those that go down and spend any money on lottery tickets. And the more money we spend, we are reducing we're increasing our odds at a very incremental rate. You know, somehow we think, well, I've got twice as many odds if I pick 2. No, you don't. You've gone from 1 out of something like 160 million to 2 out of 160 million. You've increased your odds pitifully. And yet we say, well, I'll go by 10. Boy, I'm really increasing my odds. No, you're not. And some of you are looking at me saying, Dr. Heath, you're ruining our life. I contributed for years until they changed the game lotto and they made me come up with a different formula, and I had it all worked out, all these birthdays and so forth, and I said, it's just too hard to figure out the new game. I'll probably play it again some other day. But the truth is, I ought to just write a check for $104 every year to the state government and go, and not go through the hassle of having to go in and get my tickets, right? Because the odds are against me. This is Las Vegas, folks. We're playing their card game at their table, etc. Well, anyway, information. Information in an organizational setting. We talked earlier about input-throughput processing. One can argue that organizations do nothing but input, throughput, and output, or input, process, and output. The University of Houston is an organization. You are input. You come here. We process you. We process you and we output you in various ways. Some of you we output with degrees. Degrees with honor. Others of you we just output you. You drift away. You go somewhere. Whatever happens, we don't know. Input, throughput, processing. It's a model that grew out of the original discussion of information theory by people like Norbert Wiener. The question is, what is the input? Now, to what extent is a newspaper nothing more than an organization that does input, processing, or throughput, output? Reporters go out and they interview people. Photographers go out and they take pictures. People do all of this. They get information in. They process it into a definable amount of space or time, and they output it. Have you ever wondered why there is the same amount of news every day? 30 minutes or so of news on television in the evening? It has nothing to do with the available amount of news out there in the world. It has to do with selling airtime. Isn't that right? But it's amazing to me how every day there is the same amount of news to everybody except for C-SPAN or CNN or somebody like that that runs news all day long. Flow of information through networks. Flow of information through networks. When you come to the university, to what extent do you try to learn the networks? Are classes networks? Are friends that have insight into classes networks? Do you begin to seek information? What are the good teachers? What are the bad teachers? What are the easy classes? What are the hard classes? What are the good classes? What are the bad classes? Trying to find the networks that will tell you that. Some of the people on campus are professional key elements in that network. Academic advisors, faculty, administrative staff that help you to get information to solve problems that you may have. What happens if I didn't get registered properly? What happens if I need to talk to somebody about my parking ticket? An information approach to an organization treats it as nothing more than a network of pathways through which information flows. And then the question is, to what extent is that information flow constructive so that it helps us to steer and correct what it is that we're doing within the organization as well as the organization itself. Big organizations. University of Houston is a big organization. Little organizations try to figure out what's going on. Some of you may work for stores that actually pay you to go shop at your competition. Ever been in a job like that? I one time had the good or bad experience to work in a department store furniture department. Now that's a long story, where my wife wanted us to work in department store at Christmas time. She couldn't get a job. I ended up being the one. I didn't want to work in the evenings. But I learned a lot. But one of the things they would have us do as a couple is go and shop in the other furniture stores in town, and then we would come back and tell them what was going on, etc., etc. Acquiring information which can allow us to figure out what's going on. How much do you think the automobile companies pay attention to what other automobile companies do? If one of them comes out with a 0 APR for 100 years, what's the likelihood that others of them will say, I have to use that as information to decide whether we want to do the same thing or not? Because in a competitive market, I have to constantly adjust myself to that competitive market as an organization. Do we have to do that at the University of Houston? Arguably we do, for a lot of reasons. One of which is, if we're trying to attract the best faculty, we have to know what the cost of the best faculty is. We have to be able to afford them. If we're going to be a competitive Tier 1 research university, we got to know what are the best faculty, what are the disciplines in which those best faculty would be here, what do they cost, what is the likelihood that we could hire them. One of the advantages of people like myself as a player in the University of Houston is I know a lot of people in my discipline, and that should increase the likelihood that I can attract the kind of faculty that we think you ought to study with. And that should be an advantage. And that's part of this notion of information and acquisition as feedback to steer and correct our organizations. An open organization is more likely to get information in and use it than is a closed organization. We also believe that closed organizations are less desirable to work for than those that are open. But we also know that openness and closedness is a matter of policy as well. Should the FBI be relatively closed in the development of information on a case until they think they could go to trial or make a policy recommendation? Meaning that if they make their disclosures and are open too soon, they could tip somebody off who could escape if they are legitimately guilty. We wouldn't want that. Okay, organization. What is an organization like? Using all of what we just talked about, organizations seek to be in balance. You're an organization. You're a system, aren't you? About midday, you may begin to be in balance. You begin to get hungry. If you begin to get hungry, you begin to think where it is that you're going to eat, whether you've got enough money to eat. What if your friends owes you a free lunch? What parties are there on campus that you can go and munch at? You begin to seek information that will help you to restore balance. Ironically enough, internally, our feeding mechanism is such so that after we've eaten a certain amount of food, that should tell our body quit eating more. And there's a bit of analysis that suggests if you eat slower, your body becomes senses being full in a more timely way. If you eat too fast, you eat so fast that your body doesn't know that you're too full, and then you eat more than you should. So even internally, we are an information system, if you would. One of the other characteristics of information, if we can get that slide up, I thought it was already up, is equifinality. Equifinality means that different systems can achieve the same ends, but by different means. You may be really super duper duper smart and study less than a friend of yours who has to study a great deal more. Both of you get good grades, but you had to accomplish the same outcome by different means. We've got a lot of small newspapers in the Houston area. Do they gather news in the same way that the Houston Chronicle does? Does the Daily Cougar gather information in the same way that the Houston Chronicle does? I one time heard a reporter, anchor for CNN, say that she was on the air talking about a festival where Yitzhak Rabin was in Israel, At the same time, in the back room, they were developing the story about his assassination, meaning that they had a story prepared to run at a certain time about the festival, and in the middle of telling that story, they became aware that he had been assassinated, but they couldn't do the assassination story because they didn't have the information that would help people to understand what the nature of that story was. Well, the notion is that CNN can do that and do that a lot more quickly, but obviously other news gathering agencies couldn't as well. We're going to talk even in that regard about information richness a little bit later on. Wholeness, the wholeness of an organism. Each of you is a whole organism. You are broken into subsystems. Each of you is a part of larger systems. Some of those are called families, some of those are called friendships. They may be called study groups, they may be called disciplines, they may be called universities, they may be called jobs, they may be called Texas, they may be called the United States, they may be called the Western Hemisphere, they may be called our solar system. All of these are systems. Where are we in that system? Each system is a whole. Openness we talked about a while ago. Openness simply is the ease with which information can flow in and out of the organization. Openness is simply nothing more than the ease with which information can flow in and out of an organization. Do you find that bureaucracies often put a great penalty on giving you information? Make you work awfully hard to get information? Question? Equifinality means that a characteristic of systems is this, that various systems that are same in certain respects can achieve the same outcome but by different means. A big city newspaper will put out a newspaper every day. A small community newspaper will come out less regularly, less full of news, and often full of different kinds of news. My wife subscribes to the Fayette County Register. I will guarantee you that much of what makes it into the Fayette County Register does not make it into the Houston Chronicle. The church bulletin notes, what clubs met and so forth, that's part of the Fayette County. But it's a newspaper and it informs people who want that kind of information. Complexity. Organizations differ in the amount of complexity that they have, and part of complexity is the number of subsystems that make up an organization. Part of complexity is the number of subsystems that make up an organization. Houston Chronicle has lots of subsystems. A small weekly newspaper would have less complexity, University of Houston is a very complex place. We have lots of degrees, we have lots of degree plans, we have lots of options, and we have lots of staff support options for you. Navigating and negotiating it is sometimes very difficult because of its complexity. One of the assumptions that we make is that an organization, a complex organization, should build in communication strategies that reduce the impact of the complexity on people, meaning that you can find what it is that you want relatively easily. When we get into the chapter on computer-assisted communication, we're going to argue that interactive computer-assisted communication can reduce the complexity in an organization because it increases the likelihood that if you go to one place, you can get a lot of information that you want, whereas if you have to walk around campus, you have to go to many places, and many of you have already discovered that you are often in the wrong place. So you see what we're trying to do, understanding the nature of organizations and organizations as an information system, we can begin to do analysis of organizations. Organizations engage in self-regulation. When you get tired, you want to sleep. When you get hungry, you want to eat. When you are thirsty, you want to drink. Self-regulation. Part of what can be called a medical problem is that sometimes our ability to self-regulate breaks down. I have a cousin from New Mexico that worked in the air conditioning business for a very long time, and he burned out something that we would call a thermostat in his body, so his body can't tell when he's getting too hot, and it could be fatal to him. So he has to watch very closely and rely upon other people to tell him whether it's beginning to get too hot, because I guess working in attics in Farmington, New Mexico at 120 degrees, you can have something like that happen to you. Hierarchy. Hierarchy simply means the levels within a system. We could, for our purposes here, debate which is the most important system in the human organism, the human organization. Is the neurosystem the most important? You don't live very long once your brain goes out on you, right? But then people would say, well, but your brain can't last very long if your respiration system goes out on you. And you'd look kind of terrible if your skeletal system goes out on you. I'm reminded by saying that of the scene that we were watching in the last couple of days in Harry Potter, where something happens and they try to correct the broken bone in Harry Potter and his arm becomes wiggly, limp, etc., right? Bones went soft on him because of bad cure. Well, the notion of hierarchy. We often think of the person at the top of the organization as being the most important, but the truth is that may not be true. Person at the top may not be the most important person in the organization. I, for instance, floored one of my companions the other day, who's in public relations at the university, public information, when she said, well, did you hear so-and-so's major address? And I said, no. You didn't? You don't pay attention to that? I said, no. I said, in my life, a few functionaries that keep my computer going, the guy that cleans my space, the people that serve me food, and I'm really nice to them. Want to go through serving line with me over at the UC sometime? I'll bet I get more than you do. I'm nice to those people. I ask about them, comment about them, I remember them and all of that kind of stuff. Why? Because they're important to me. Because if I'm nice, they'll make sure that I get the good potatoes, not the ones that are kind of burned, you see? Will Googe do that? Will Strickland do that? I mean, they're not serving potatoes. I want good potatoes, you see. So the notion is the importance of somebody often is not the person at the top. It may well be the person at the bottom. We often like to talk about the person that is the head of the news-gathering organization, the president. Having a bunch of good reporters is far more important to the success of a newspaper than necessarily having a smart president or a smart person at the top of an organization. Smart person at the top of an organization hires qualified, competent, really good people at the bottom part of the organization. But the people at the bottom of the organization are very important, and they have a lot of power. One of my favorite stories goes this way. A fellow was working on an oil rig. Inadvertently, he dropped a tool down an open shaft. They called in the engineers to find out how much it would cost to drill through the tool. They called in the engineers to find out how much it would cost to retrieve the tool. They made an estimation, decided that it would be cheaper to retrieve it. They spent the money to retrieve the tool rather than drill through it. Foreman on the rig handed the tool to the man and said, here, now, there's your tool. You cost us a lot of time and money, and you're fired. And the man said, well, then I won't need the tool anymore, and dropped it back down in the well. How much power did he have? He was at the bottom in an organizational chart, but how much power did he have? In your life, encountering a big company, it is often that functional person that can solve your problem and deal with the organization as being responsive to you that makes your impression of the organization positive or negative. Has nothing to do with the president, but it may be that individual that you call in on a 1-800 number or whatever it might be, and they help you to solve your problem. So hierarchy has to do with the layer of systems and the combination of systems far more than it does something simply at the level of, we might call, power built into the organizational chart. Interdependence? Oh, yes.
What is self-regulation?
Self-regulation means that an organization uses feedback to determine whether its strategies are likely or continuing to produce the benefits which the organization seeks. Is that a good definition? I like that. I'd run over and get that one on tape. There are days when I impress myself. There are not many. That was one of those where I thought that was a pretty nifty little definition. Interdependence, the parts of an organization influence the success of the other parts of the organization or the whole of the organization. My evidence in that regard is Houston Texans. I understand that nobody was appropriately interdependent with anyone else on Sunday. Is that right? Meltdown, that's what I heard. Every mistake that could be made was made. Well, interdependence. If you've got a good quarterback and you don't have anybody that can run out and catch the ball, that's a problem. If you have really good people that can get open and nobody can throw the ball, really a problem. So you see, the elements of an organization are interdependent. The elements of an organization are interdependent. Well, discussions of this kind help us to understand then some of the theories that we will expand upon in our later treatment of organizational communication as a separate chapter. One of the theories that we'll talk about is structural functionalism. Structural functionalism is a theory that predicts the success of an organization is, in a sense, the effectiveness of that organization measured on the criteria that I just mentioned. Its ability to achieve balance, its ability to achieve interdependence, it is ability to achieve self-regulation, it is ability to be open appropriately, etc., etc. And we'll talk about all of the elements of structural functionalism. In that regard, then, if you think of yourself working in an organization, and this is where we begin to be interested in how theory and research informs our daily life, competence may mean your ability to handle lots of information. You want to be a reporter. You sign up. You say, I want to go to the University of Houston. I want to get a degree that will allow me to be a reporter. To what extent is your ability to be a good reporter tied to your competence, your ability to handle lots of information? To what extent is your competence as a student your ability to handle lots of information? One of the things I think we teach students, if we can get this screen up, this would be a good one for the students to have. There we go. One of the things that I think we teach you is your ability to get, process, and output information. Does that sound like something we talked about before? Input, throughput, output. We have you write papers. You go out, you get information, you translate it into a well-written paper, and you output it and you get an A on it. Self-regulation says I did the right thing, I used the right principles, and I got the right reward. It's how we function, isn't it? Information theory suggesting how we function. You're in public relations. To what extent does your competence in public relations relate to your ability to handle lots of information? See, I think that's one of the things that we try to teach you. We'll also, when we get into the chapter in mediated communication, indicate that computers allow us to handle more information, allow us to handle the same amount of information faster. So we begin to see how some of our sort of opening discussions of these concepts and principles begin to foretell where we will go and how we will advance this. Complexity, the number of variables that can be handled at a given time. Are you the kind of person that can study sort of 3 courses at the same time, or are you the kind of person that has to focus on only one thing at a time? Complexity, the number of variables to be handled. Yeah. Can we get the screen back up there? Not sure where it went. There we go. Thank you. Complexity, the number of variables to be handled. In 1990, 7, 8, 9, maybe even into the year 2000, investing in the stock market was easy. Some of you have talked to people that thought there wasn't anything but an upward. All of a sudden the stock market began to come down, and the question is, with all of this complexity, when should I start selling? When should I get out? When should I do this? And some people did and some people didn't, etc., etc. Life is risk management. If you're out driving your automobile by yourself, your complexity in dealing with that is a lot different than if you have all kinds of cars around you and all of you are going, except for 2 or 3, above the speed limit. and 2 are going at the speed limit, and 1 is going substantially below the speed limit. Your complexity is beginning to increase. How do I navigate? How do I maneuver? How do I do this? How do I do that? And just when you think you've got it all down, here comes somebody sailing across the front of you, 4 lanes over, and then they're over on the far side, and then you say, where did they come from? See? Complexity. We woke up one morning, 9/11, and the world was relatively simple, wasn't it? And by nightfall it had become relatively complex. The amount of uncertainty had increased because acts that were labeled terrorist had been perpetrated against the World Trade Center, airlines, passengers, the Pentagon, and so forth. Turbulence. If we can get the screen back up. Turbulence. Turbulence is entropy. The greater the amount of randomness, the greater amount of turbulence. You're flying on an airplane, you experience turbulence. It begins to shake. Do you become uncertain? Do you begin to find religious inspiration? Right? I have been sitting by people on planes. I kind of like it. I don't know why, right? Rattles a little bit. When people get religious and out loud, oh my God! They get religion and they get it out loud when that plane begins to shudder. A friend of mine flying from Los Angeles to Albuquerque one night was sitting next to a guy that had helped to design that particular kind of plane. Over Arizona, sucker is just going up and down and the wings are going like this, and my friend is terrified, so much so that when he gets out he's got a napkin clutched in his hand, and I said to him, what have you got in your hand? Because it was clutched like a fist, and he says, my napkin. He was terrified, and the guy next to him was saying, look what this plane will do, isn't this wonderful? See? So the way in which we react to turbulence, turbulence being entropy, turbulence being randomness. Finally, information load, the amount of information that you have to handle. When we talk a little bit later on about capacity, we'll see this in a slightly different way. Information load means that you've got a certain amount of information that's got to be handled. Relevant to that is your capacity to handle information. Now, one of the ways to deal with capacity is to simply ignore it. There's a wonderful line in a movie called Gone with the Wind, which some of you may have heard of, where all kinds of things are happening in the life of Scarlett O'Hara. And she's confronted with yet one more problem, and she says, I'll think about that tomorrow. Meaning, I just can't handle any more information today. And I think that there are times when we get like that. Isn't that right? We have to kind of decompress. But by the same token, there are times when we want as much information as we can get, something going on. I remember being in a class at the University of New Mexico, and a student in that department could see who we were in that classroom as he was coming through the building because there were windows in the classroom. He opened the door and he said, the President of the United States has been shot. This is John Kennedy's assassination day. Our class continued for about 10 minutes, and people began to say, should we be here when we should be out somewhere else? So we went to the UC and we went to one place or another. By the time we got to the University Center, it was hard to get close to a television set because people were watching the television set. My guess is that a lot of the same sort of thing happened in 9/11 2 years ago, where the information overload was substantial. But by the same token, you wanted as much information as you could get. You were trying to process it as well as you could. So we get interested in the issues of information load. Now, just as a sort of prelude going into mass media will be the last of the units that we will discuss before we turn our attention to our examination. And so what I want to do on Thursday is to finish our discussion of mass-mediated communication and information. And then I want to spend as much time as you would like doing a review. But let's preview a little bit. To what extent is the mass media system what it is, and and maybe some of us wanting to be in that industry because of its information conveying, information acquiring, information processing capacity. Is that a way of thinking about the mass media industry? When we think about that, we often think about the news. But let's talk about entertainment. To what extent is entertainment an informing part of mass mediated communication? What do you think? To what extent is entertainment part of that? Yeah.
I think it's a big part, and you know, we've seen news become entertainment, and the whole thing with reality TV, I think, is like voyeurism as mass entertainment.
We have a lot of voyeurism. To some extent, football, basketball, baseball is voyeur. I want to see people get killed, maimed. I want to see them fly up into the air. I want to see them get smushed. I want to see what happens when a 380-pound person runs into a 160-pound person. And I call that the NFL, right? To what extent is a football game information processing? That you start off and the score is 0-0. And the question is the uncertainty at the end of the game. Is the kind of uncertainty the same if it is just a game or it is the game, the biggest game of the year, whatever that might be? Now, some of you say every game is big, and others of you say, ho-hum, no game is big. Well, that suggests, again, the notion of individuals' information seeking, processing, outputting preferences, capacities, and so forth. The Emmys, is that information, entertainment? Do you care whether The Sopranos won any more Emmys this year or not? Isn't it amazing how much of entertainment programming is informative, and it is the information that, why do they put the Academy Awards the way they do, so that you build up to Best Picture, Best Actress, Best all of those at the very end? So you can sell advertising dollars. Why don't they just get that over with at the beginning? Because that's what everybody wants to find out, right? They used to have all of these technical design stuff, and then they found that nobody except the other technical design people care. Because most of us don't know what it is at all anyway. So a set design, what would a good set design be? What would a bad set design? We don't know, but we want to know whether our favorite actor or actress won or our hated actor or actress lost, don't we? We want to know that kind of outcome. Children find television to be enormously informative. There is even argument that we learn what is adult and socially acceptable. One of the complaints about advertising, alcohol beverage advertising, tobacco advertising, is that it gives children insights into adult behavior at a time before children should be able to process that. We also find some research that's rather interesting that again talks about the notion of what goes on in a family or what goes on in a group as opposed to what is just in the medium. If a child watches an advertisement, and an advertisement may be information, is that right? Advertisement is information, even if it's socio-emotional information. When I'm watching an ad about a race car going very, very fast, am I really thinking of the difference between 160 miles an hour and 150 miles an hour? Or am I thinking of the sort of exhilarating feeling of watching posts go blip, 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 hoping that they keep going blip, 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 and one of them then go blop? That would be a bad day if going blip, 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 wouldn't it? But anyway, am I thinking about the speed of driving that automobile as informative? This car goes fast. See, that's why men are such primitive. We think in little bitty propositions like this. This car goes fast. This guy hits hard. That's as complex as we can get, ladies. I will be here to tell you that, right? But it's informative, isn't it? It's informative. Which product will do the most good? Which product will really perform as it is advertised, etc., etc. Well, what I'm also doing is suggesting that this attempt to separate persuasion and information gets to be very foggy. Going back again to the theme that we sort of started with, and that is that if we press ourselves hard enough, we realize that even newscasts are persuasive because they persuade us that a particular view of the world is as we are reporting. Yes?
Are they persuasive because it's a person's interpretation?
If you believe that's what happens, and that's what they wanted you to believe, then they persuaded you just as an advertisement would. Is that right? Is that right? Yeah, that's what I would say. Comment? No? No? Okay. Other comments, questions? Well, anyway, that's sort of previewing where we're going to go. We'll also talk in sort of glimpsy ways about some of the theories that relate to mass media, and we'll emphasize a concept that's really nifty, I think, called information richness. Information richness. Don't even know whether it's on the review sheet. Information richness. Hint, 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 hint. All right. I figure for the people that are here, you might get a break. Right? Now you'll get a chance to reduce your uncertainty to see if I live up to my hint, hint, hint. Okay. Well, we'll turn our attention to mass-mediated communication and information theory on Thursday. See you then.